Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Just terrific to have you here. Thank you all for joining us for the Beyond the Headlines event. You know, that's this wonderful series we do, so this is yet another one of those. And tonight's event is Trump Foreign Policy, Changing and Disrupting Global Norms. With Ann Guerin, diplomatic correspondent for the Washington Post, Jay Solomon, chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, and Julie Hirschfield Davis, White House correspondent for the New York Times. Just an amazing panel, really exciting. I am Gail Kitch. I'm chair of the board of the Women's Foreign Policy Group, which promotes women's leadership and voices on pressing international issues of the day. On behalf of the WFPG board members who are here tonight, Elizabeth Buemiller, who you'll also be hearing from tonight, Kate Irvin and Jebby Martinez, and our partners here at NYU Washington, D.C., we are so glad that you could all join us. We are also so pleased to be back here for this very timely event and greatly appreciate NYU's warm hospitality and partnership and to see students here. We know part of our obvious interest is in the next generation of folks. I think it's terrific to have young people here, folks of all ages. But at NYU, also just a critical partner in that effort. Before we begin the program, I'd like to also extend a warm welcome to the ambassadors and other diplomats who are here with us tonight. We have so many friends here. And ask the ambassadors to stand to be acknowledged. Please, I know you're here. Please stand up. We just so support you and other folks in premises. Terrific. Just terrific. Just terrific. I also want to mention we have an exciting schedule of upcoming events. An event with women DCMs, that would be Deputy Chief of Missions, and an authors series event, all of which can be found in your programs. There's just really just a great list of all the things we're going to be doing. And of course, we look forward to seeing all of you at some of those events. And it is now my pleasure to introduce and welcome back tonight's moderator, Elizabeth Buemiller, a Women's Foreign Policy Group member and the Washington Bureau Chief of the New York Times, who previously covered the Pentagon, the White House, and John McCain's 2008 campaign, A Woman with Battle Scars. Elizabeth, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Gail. And thank you all for coming out. And I'm sorry Pat couldn't be here tonight. Pat Ellis, she's not feeling well. Normally she would be here, but anyway, thank you all. And thank you to the panelists. You can all read, so I'm going to be very brief in my introductions. Ann Guerin is the title diplomatic correspondent for the Washington Post. She did cover Clinton's campaign this past year. What you don't see in her bio is that Ann and I traveled together a lot when we were both covering the Defense Department. We shared a very strange, what was that, a container in Islamabad?
Yes,
right?
yeah, one of the tin cans.
Yeah, so we go way back, as they say. Jay Solomon is the Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, and he has just published a terrific book, The Iran Wars, Spy Games, Bank Battles, and the Secret Deals That Reshaped the Middle East. That was published last year, and he knows everything about the Iran deal, and he can tell you that. We'll ask him. Julie Davis is one of our White House correspondent for the New York Times. She is terrific. She's been at the Times for how many? It seems like a long time. 3 years. It seems like forever. She is, I'm her boss. I can tell you that she is in a Washington bureau of a lot of very talented, very intense reporters. She is a total professional, never loses her cool. She's amazing, and she's a great reporter, and she's been covering up close the Trump White House. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of our panelists a question or two, and then I'm going to open it up to you. So you have to have really good questions. And I want to also thank you all for coming out to see this great display of the mainstream media here. You're very brave, you know. Here we are, in all our glory, right? Okay, so Ann, give us a 3-minute presentation, then I'll. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll give you what we can divine of Trump foreign policy in the State Department in 3 minutes. I'm lucky in that we don't know very much about Trump's foreign policy, and the State Department doesn't appear to be central to it. So During the campaign, which as Elizabeth said, I was covering the opposing candidate, so I had an odd lens on, and of course she was a former Secretary of State and foreign policy is her thing, national security is her thing. So we had an odd lens during the campaign on what we thought Trump's foreign policy priorities were going to be. And I would argue that so did they, the Trump campaign, because they were campaigning, and in many ways, they didn't think they were actually going to be governing. So their foreign policy priorities were entirely filtered through the lens of a populist-based, trade-based, and oppositional campaign. Hillary Clinton was the main opponent, but also many other things were the opponent. Rapacious foreign trade, China, Mexico, and a little bit, about ISIS and threats from the Middle East in general, but never a great deal of specificity on those things. It was hard to define when he actually won what that would translate to in terms of a priorities list. We have some greater clarity now. Clearly, the fight against ISIS and more diffuse threats coming from the Middle East is something that is very, very high on their minds and is likely to be the first organizing principle for where they put their money and their focus. But they had a lot of catch up to do because they really didn't have any kind of firm plan of what that would actually mean. And they're starting to develop that now. Staying a bit on the Middle East piece, the perennial golden ring for every American president is clearly one that Trump wants to get. And he's deputized his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who has no prior experience in this file, to do that. And I don't say that dismissively. There's every reason to believe as much with this administration as any other that giving it a try and giving it a try in a different way, will have as much chance of success as we've previously seen, which is to say that there's very little chance of success, but everybody tries it. They're trying it a different way. I think it'll be really fascinating to watch how that plays out. We have not yet tried the model of an owner-operated Middle East peace operation coming from the White House. It's not Trump's bag himself, but people around him who are very close to him, it is their bag, and it is very much something that he has made a policy priority. And I think he will be hiring and organizing accordingly. It appears at this point to be largely an effort that would ask the Arab states to put pressure on the Palestinians to make some accommodation. And it appears to be walking away from the premise that a separate independent Palestinian state alongside Israel is the ultimate goal. That will be probably the biggest foreign policy change he effects in the first term if it actually happens. If they actually do a full-on divorce from the two-state solution as an operating principle, that will be historic. And the other thing I wanted to just mention quickly is China. China was a great boogeyman during the campaign. Of course, he made a diplomatic punch in the nose to China right off the bat by arranging the call to be placed to him from the Taiwanese president. Had never been done before. Great hullabaloo. You all know that story. They didn't know what they were getting into. It was an intentional punch in the nose to China. It was an intentional way of showing that they were going to do foreign policy differently. But the backlash was something that they hadn't anticipated, and it has informed a great deal of the foreign policy organizing since. I think that's my 3 minutes.
Great.
Great.
Jay, can you start? But you could also could you give me could I use a pen?
Mine ran out.
Ran out, right?
Okay, so the www.germany.info pen didn't work.
Okay,
There you go.
okay, Jay, you're up.
That's a G7 pen.
Okay, right.
I'm going to
NATO
focus
pen.
on the Middle
NATO
East.
pen.
And during the campaign, Donald Trump very much focused on basically criticizing the Obama administration's foreign policy, specifically on Iran, and suggesting he was going to radically change policy over the past 8 years. And I think there are 4 areas that I want to focus on because I think that's what we're likely to see over the next 4 years. The first is Iran, and if you kind of follow the campaign, you know that President Trump was very critical of the Iran agreement. He said this was the worst negotiated deal in the history of U.S. diplomacy, and kind of vacillated between saying he was going to walk away from it or renegotiate it. And it's been interesting since in the month he's been in office, you can already see them kind of walking back a little bit. They did, in the first couple of weeks, say they were going to put Iran on notice. They sanctioned 25 companies from the Revolutionary Guard, which is Iran's Praetorian Guard, its elite military unit. But at the same time, you don't hear so much that they're going to walk it back or tear it up. You still hear talk about renegotiating it, but what I do think we're starting to see, and it's interesting, a lot of the people in the White House are military officers who were in Iraq, focused, dealt firsthand just how aggressive Iran was in sabotaging the U.S. project in Iran and supporting militias that were fighting the United States. So I think on Iran, you can already get a sense that they're going to start trying to confront Iran much more aggressively in places like the Persian Gulf, in Yemen, cutting off weapons shipments into Syria for the Assad regime, even if they're not going to pull out from the agreement. But I think there is a risk if they aggressively pursue Iran, if they sanction the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which they've suggested they might do, that could potentially blow up the deal. So I think Iran is going to be one of the flashpoints. Syria also was another contentious issue during the debate season, and President Trump was very displayed real wariness of getting involved in Syria and sucked in, but he did and has described setting up safe zones. And I think this is where this is going to work. If it's going to work, is going to be what Trump has talked about, which is some sort of cooperation with the Russians inside Syria. But I think that is going to be extremely difficult politically. Any moves I think Trump makes to sort of reach out to the Russians in this environment is going to be attacked because he's been basically attacked as being a Russian, being too soft to the Russians. So I think it's going to be very difficult for him to execute some sort of safe zone in Syria. And he also has talked about trying to break Iran away from away from Russia inside Syria, because that alliance has basically been the lifeblood of the Assad regime. But I think he's going to find that a much more difficult operation than he thinks, just because the links between Tehran, Damascus, and Moscow are so deep. Middle East peace, as Ann was saying, is another area that's going to be contentious and which he is really focused on. I think it's also an area where we've seen him walking things back a little bit. During the build-up to his presidency and the first few weeks, there's all this speculation that he's going to announce the U.S. Embassy is going to move to Jerusalem. I mean, I think some people are reporting it could have happened in the first week. Then you started to see King Abdullah of Jordan come in to the White House. You've seen President Trump talk to the president of Egypt, other Arab leaders. I think the message has clearly been passed on that moving that embassy could be could set off a real powder keg in the Middle East, and not something he wants to deal with. So I'm increasingly confident he's walking that back. But he has, as Ann was saying, talked about a one-state solution, moving away what has been basically U.S. policy since 1967. Whether that proves any more successful than what the Obama administration did remains to be seen, but there is kind of a shift where they talk, and the Israelis have talked about this, kind of the inward working from the Arab states back to the Palestinians, which is improving relations between the U.S., Israel, and the Arab states, and basically pressuring the Palestinians into some agreement. I'm pretty skeptical that's going to work, but that is kind of the strategy that's emerging on the Middle East peace process. And last is ISIS, where it's interesting because I think a lot of what Trump is betting on is essentially an alliance with the Russians, with al-Sisi, with other strongmen in the Middle East, which is the complete reverse of what George W. Bush basically concluded, that extremism in the Middle East was being driven by these despotic regimes, by the US supporting authoritarian governments for the last 50 years. But Trump seems to be content to basically go back to the old way and really strengthen relationships with Egypt and some of these other countries. And I think, whether he's able to succeed remains to be seen, but you're seeing almost a complete reversal of where the Bush administration came out at the end of their 8 years and basically from the fallout of 9/11. So it's really those four areas in the Middle East where I'm going to be focusing in the next 12 months.
Great, thank you. Okay, Julie.
So I'll just talk a little bit about how the White House is working in foreign policy and in general since Trump took over. And I'm glad that Jay mentioned the issue of the embassy, because I think one of the sort of broad observations we can make both on foreign policy and pretty much every other issue is that this is a president who kind of values unpredictability and sort of challenging long-held assumptions and poking hornets' nests that are not supposed to be poked, sometimes for its own sake. Sometimes there's a policy objective at the end of that. I'm not sure that President Trump is really thinking through what those might be. I know some of his staff are, and as Anne mentioned, with the Taiwan call during the transition, they've certainly had to sort of rewind the tape several times and go back and figure out what the implications are of some of these moves. But there is a premium that President Trump seems to place on showing that he's willing to do some of these things that color outside the lines of what we're used to seeing in terms of American foreign policy and diplomacy. So I would put the Taiwan call in that category. Certainly the talk about moving the embassy to Jerusalem, the talk about potentially encouraging Israel to do more settlements rather than do fewer settlements in the interest of finding a way to get to Middle East peace. But what we're also seeing on the other side of that coin is a sort of retreat when it comes to actually when the rubber meets the road, if he's having meetings with people, if he has to make a statement on something. When it came time for the visit with Prime Minister Netanyahu, for instance, he didn't talk at all, or didn't talk very much at all about the embassy moving. He asked publicly for Israel to hold off for maybe a little bit on settlements, and he was sort of sheepish, but that was the opposite of what they had been signaling from the beginning. So we hear a lot of public pronouncements that seem to herald a big change on some of these issues and in some of these hotspots, but in reality, we haven't actually seen that big of a change. When it came time for him to have his phone call with Xi Jinping, he ended up saying that he was behind the one China policy. That was something that he had left in doubt during the transition and in the run-up to that call. So there's this real effort, I think, on the part of the president to show that he's willing to shake up some of the assumptions here. But when it comes to actually executing, I don't think we're seeing that big of a change. What I think is fascinating to watch just in these first few weeks as well is the sort of power struggle that's going on in the White House and with the State Department, with the Pentagon, who is going to be the focal point and who's actually going to be driving these policies. There are a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill who I think would like to see Secretary Mattis, the Defense Secretary, having more of a take charge role. They see him as a force of stability in what seems like a very disorganized and in some ways chaotic National Security Council. They want to see him exert himself. It's not clear whether that's really going to happen. As Anne mentioned, state has been somewhat sidelined. Rex Tillerson has been kind of a non-entity in a strange way for someone who Trump talked up so fulsomely before he was confirmed, and he was going to be tough and he was going to be great. We haven't really seen much of him or what he wants to do. So I think it's a real open question who's going to be speaking for this administration, and Trump keeps feeding that sort of debate, because he'll say one thing that sounds sort of meek or accepting on Russia and Russia's activities in Ukraine, and then we see Nikki Haley at the UN make a very strong statement condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine, and it's this is the same administration, but the president and the UN ambassador are not necessarily speaking from the same hymnal. So it's not a standard division of labor here, and I think one of the things I'll be trying to divine over the next few months is who is actually driving this, who's taking the reins. in the context of a White House where the president doesn't really have much of his own sort of deeply held worldview about how to execute foreign policy. We hear America first, but it's not really clear how that all plays out in terms of policy. So
Great. Let me ask Julie a first question, which is not totally about foreign policy, because we'll get to that. I want you to tell the crowd here what it is like to cover this White House day to day. Just, because I know they're going to ask, and it's way different than any other White House.
it's very different from any other. So I've covered the Obama administration, and I covered Bush 43 for a brief time. It's just totally different. I mean, it's for one thing, when you are in the briefing room and you're sort of asking questions of senior officials at the White House, it's a much more adversarial kind of a engagement. I mean, it's not just your normal sort of raise your hand, ask your question, get your answer, follow up if you have one. It's really the atmosphere in the briefing room has become quite combative. Sean Spicer, the press secretary, seems to relish that. He certainly, that's certainly the tone that he sets. Behind the scenes, it's actually a fairly accessible administration because that is, they have so few people, really. I mean, the press office is a fairly small operation still. The senior advisors in the White House is a very small group. And you can sort of wander around. There's a lot of waiting outside of Sean Spicer's office for his comings and goings to try to get him on any given issue. He's not responding most of the time to emails or phone calls. They have no compunction whatsoever about just, you tell them you're doing a story. They know the premise of the story. If you may never hear from them. They don't feel any obligation to weigh in or not to weigh in. There doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason to when they decide to engage on a story. And there really is, I mean, right before Elizabeth and I came, there was an interview that President Trump did in the Oval Office with a reporter from Breitbart News where he's talking about, the New York Times is lying all the time and the New York Times has evil intent and is making things up. It's a whole another level of adversarial dynamic that it's just that, any reporter covering the White House, you always have to question what you hear in the briefing room. You always have to, do a dozen interviews behind the scenes for every clear answer you're going to get on camera in the briefing room, and we always scrutinize whatever we hear. But this White House, it's just a whole nother level of trying to figure out where you're going to get your actual information. And the other thing, just to quickly, I don't want to go on too long, but you could ask two senior officials about the exact same issue and get two totally separate, totally opposite answers. And somebody's lying or somebody's, isn't briefed in, and it's not unusual at all. And that really is unique. I mean, on my most confused days covering the Obama White House, at least the senior staff was all saying basically the same thing, maybe in a different way, but they all sort of had the same talking points. They were putting forth the same argument. That is not the case with this White House, and in some ways it does make it more interesting to cover. Right. And it can be it can help your reporting, but it can also make it really difficult to try. You can't necessarily trust what you're hearing coming from, officials who speak on the record on behalf of this White House, and that's just a very disorienting feeling. So.
Great, thanks. Let me ask Jay, I know you talked about how politically impossible cooperation with Russia is in Syria against ISIS, but what would it look like in your view, the U.S. and Russia cooperating in Syria? How would that play out on the ground?
I mean, President Trump has talked about, okay, we're going to set up some sort of safe zones. I think it's the flip on, okay, we're not going to let refugees in, but
safe zones is a military operation.
Yeah, and
that's taking out air defenses. You all know it. It's a big military operation.
Well, I think he kind of envisions it as, okay, we're going to be in cooperation with the Russians. So
they're going to take out the air defense.
Well, they're not going to take out the air defenses.
Right,
they're going to be in some sort of tacit cooperation with the Russians, who are in alliance with the Assad regime, Hezbollah, and Iran, which is why I don't think it's practical. I think in his greatest, I don't think they've thought that through, but I think in their greatest kind of dream, it's like, okay, we're not the Obama administration let this thing burn, and it
Right.
sent hundreds of thousands of refugees into the Middle East and into Europe, which is destabilizing our allies, which I think there's truth to that. But I think instead of taking people in, you say, okay, we're going to set up these safe zones in cooperation with the Russians. We're going to let them sort of deal with the Syrians, and rather than people coming out, they're going to stay in these safe zones. But I just think, I don't think it's practical. And to be honest, John Kerry spent the last 18 months, 2 years of his Secretary of Stateship trying to create basically a fused military operation with the Russians inside
Can barely
Syria,
do
and it never worked. And I think if Trump tried to do that now, people would go nuts, saying, you're basically on the
Right.
take with the Russians. So I don't think in Syria it's practical. I think on a broader level, the Russians are very engaged now in Egypt, in Libya, to some extent. They're close to King Abdullah in Jordan. The relations with Israel is good. So in the last 2 or 3 years, the Russians really have spread their influence across the region and have made alliance with a lot of countries that are basically U.S. was allies. So in some ways, you have no choice now
Right.
but to try to deal with them. But whether there can be any practical cooperation in Syria and Libya in the fight against ISIS, I'm pretty skeptical.
And let me just, before I get to Ann, why did Trump, after saying over and over again that he was going to tear up the Iran deal on the first day in office, why have they not walked away from it?
He was a little bit more kind of unclear on that. Sometimes he'd say, yeah, I'm going to tear it up. Sometimes he'd say, why are Asian and European companies going back into Iran under this agreement and we're not? And Secretary Tillerson during his hearings would kind of say he wasn't a huge fan of sanctions. So I think politically attacking the deal was very easy. I still wonder if at some point the deal side of Trump and Tillerson will come in and they're going to say, look, this Iran agreement is Swiss cheese. We got to renegotiate it. But if we do, we want American companies in there. We want ExxonMobil doing Iran oil and gas deals. And yeah, if you really put a cap on your nuclear program, we'll really lift sanctions. I doubt the Iranians will go for it. I doubt the Europeans will want to go through another 2 years of negotiations. But I still wonder if that's part of Trump's kind of thinking, like, this is the second, third largest energy producer in the world. We should be going back in there. So we'll have to see.
Can I add one
Yeah.
thing to that? I mean, another thing that happened is that important Arab allies like Jordan and Saudi Arabia were like, whoa, don't be ripping that up right
Yeah,
away.
right.
Like, there's some value in this. It's keeping a lid on Iran in the region. I mean, it isn't really in the sense that Iran is certainly continuing to fund Hezbollah and doing all sorts of other nefarious activities, but it stopped the drive toward a full-on nuclear weapon in a way that sort of neutered Iran as a daily threat certainly to Israel, and to Arab allies as well. Their still organizing principle for our Arab allies is to unite against Iran, but the idea that the Iran deal kind of slowed it down and just let a little pressure out of the whole thing, and kind of made Iran actually have to now pay attention and stick to the deal, was a useful diplomatic and national security objective in and of itself, and that sort of goes back to the long-held Israeli view, which Netanyahu used to very much espouse, and we're not totally sure he does now, that just slow them down, that buying time is worth buying time, and this does that, and we are sure that on some level the Israelis are telling the Trump administration the same thing.
Right. So speaking of Israel, what we speak in code in Washington, there's a two-state solution, there's a one-state solution. We all know what the two-state solution looks like. What does a one-state solution look like?
So it could look like a couple different things, and none of them look very good from the objective of all the things the United States has said it always wants, which is which is essentially peace and democracy for everybody, and citizenship for everybody. A unitary state could be full citizenship for Palestinians with voting rights. Very few people think that that is likely. So something short of that makes somebody a second-class citizen in some way. And if Israel is the de facto or real ruler, then Palestinians become second-class citizens in some fashion. There are other potential models. There's a Confederate model in which some parts of the West Bank are absorbed into Israel. Some other parts of the West Bank have pretty much real local control in a patchwork thing, and other parts of the West Bank are Israeli controlled but Palestinian administered. There's even the idea that many Palestinians might choose to be resettled. I don't think that that's realistic, but if you get a lot of Arab states involved, and especially rich Gulf ones, who are willing to fund resettlement in Jordan and perhaps Sinai and other places, that at least is something that might be on the table. That's a very long way of saying it's a lot of mishmash stuff that would be extraordinarily unappealing to almost any American administration you could imagine. So we don't know at this point whether any of that could possibly be appealing to the Trump administration.
Okay. And but last question before I open it. Tell us about, do you think that Rex Tillerson will emerge at some point as a stronger voice?
Will he be freed? Free Rex.
Yeah.
I think we're gonna start holding up little signs at the State Department. Free Rex.
So, because we know that he's been put on a very short leash for now. I mean, what is your expectation?
I wish I could say it was high. I think he's a very capable, smart guy who's doing this for the right reasons. I do wonder whether he wonders if he knew what he was getting himself into. There's no mandate for the State Department right now, and everybody feels it. And he obviously feels it because he's not doing anything. He's not doing a mandate. He's not going around the world doing the usual Secretary of State kind of things. Yes, this is a different administration that's going to do things differently. He himself has said, look, I'm not running for anything. I'm not a politician. I don't want another job. I'm doing this to be the Secretary of State and because the president asked me to do it. Okay, but you still need an organizing principle. You still need to tell other countries why you're there and what you're doing. And he's articulated no separate goal or thing he wants to do. Middle East peace will be done by the White House. He'll help, and there's really no other big, and ISIS policy will be done by the Pentagon and the White House, and he'll help. And there's no other big organizing principle that he's yet articulated. I mean, John Kerry's was climate change, and that didn't go that great, but at least he had something to talk about as he went around the world everywhere he went. It was a thing. He could hold conferences. And then it became Middle East peace, and the same thing. That didn't go that well, but he had
the nuclear deal for a while,
right? Ooh, and the
yes.
nuclear deal, right?
Syria.
It was
Syria, right.
So those things can just happen to administrations. Like all of a sudden they have to deal with Syria, and that wasn't something that at the dawn of the Obama administration looked like it would be a defining thing at all, and it became that way. So I mean, if I had to bet, I'd say that either North Korea or Pakistan will become, not by his choice, something that the State Department has to mobilize and do something about. And we could see him emerge in more of a leadership role. But he's not got enough independent hiring authority. He apparently thought he was going to have more than he has.
Right.
And so that's not a good sign. He hasn't been at the White House foreign leader meetings, the first of which was arranged before he was confirmed. Not his fault, but they could have waited, and they chose not to. Not a good sign. He had dinner with Bibi the night that Bibi got to town, but then Tillerson was leaving to go to Bonn the next day for the G20 foreign ministers meeting. Again, Bibi will come to Washington a different day. Like, that can be arranged. That's not that hard a thing, and they chose to do it differently. So those are not good signs for him.
I mean, one thing I think people forget under Obama, Hillary Clinton did not seem to have much influence early on either. He ran a very tight foreign policy.
Tried, yeah.
And it was, I think the difference to me, and Julie probably knows this more, it's like you've got a bunch of weird different factions in this administration. You've got the kind of the Breitbart, Bannon, real ideologues who seem to be extremely close to the president. You have the NSC, very military. I mean, like all these guys basically are colonels, retired colonels, generals. You've got some business finance guys who were replaced by Peter Thiel in there, and you've got the family, and it's a much more fissured operation than the Obama administration. I don't think Hillary, she had the Middle East peace was taken over by Senator Mitchell. The AFPAC was done initially by Holbrooke. So she kind of, it was never that clear. It was more Asia that what she was going to do, but it was just the Trump administration has all these factions, and it's really hard to tell who's
I think
running it.
just quickly, I think the big difference, I think it's a good comparison. I do think that sort of by default what's happening is that a lot of these foreign policy decisions are being run out of the White House. The difference is, as I said, I don't think there's really much of a strategic vision for how they want this to play out. So I think there was in the Obama White House. They had certain ways they wanted to handle things. I think that's still emerging on a lot of these issues in this White House. And Jay's right that you do have, not just the factions that he laid out, but a very kind of embattled NSC right now. I mean, I think they're coming out of it now that they have a national security advisor in McMaster who seems to have been somewhat of a calming influence since he came in and seems to want things to be organized and not fly by the seat of their pants. But Bannon is still on the Principals Committee of the National Security Council, so he is going to have a vote, not just a voice, but a vote in a lot of these decisions. And so that's going to affect the way that things happen. And I think that's probably one of the reasons you see, that, and also I don't think you can necessarily discount the lack of planning that has gone into these things. One of the things that has marked what President Trump says that, everyone goes crazy, oh my God, I can't believe he said that. He's not as precise with words. They're not as precise with planning and the way these visits unfold and the way these pictures unfold as we've seen other administrations be in that. And people take diplomatic signals from that. And they're not always intended, I think. I think a lot of this is just maybe they just didn't plan the Bibi visit on the right day, and it was just, maybe it's a bad side for Rex Tillerson, maybe it's just that they don't really understand yet the gravity that people invest in these symbols.
But if you're the Secretary of State, shouldn't you be able to go to the White House and say, hey, I know my confirmation isn't likely until next week, but maybe could we hold off and have Theresa May come in 2 weeks? And, I'm the Secretary of State. Maybe couldn't we have Bibi come, on Thursday instead of Wednesday?
But that would be the kind of Secretary of State who would be free to choose his own deputy, for instance.
Yes, that would be that guy, yeah.
Well, that, Ann, I know you've noticed this, things are different when the generals are the ones who are bringing stability. Peter Beggar did this great story last week about the three generals, Mattis, McMaster, and Kelly, and things have changed since the 1960s when it was like, oh my God, it's a military coup. No, these are
people want the coup.
they want the generals, right?
Yeah. People are like, everyone was so happy about McMaster.
I know.
Goody.
So that is a very different, but and also these generals have been through very, very, very different wars. It's a very different military generation. So interesting. Okay, who has questions? Here in the back, the gentleman, your hand was up first.
Thank you. This has been very interesting. I do have to say I'm stunned that no one mentioned the budget.
Oh, right. Well, we can do that. Would you like us to talk?
Well, the fact that the budget proposal increases defense, I'm not surprised. But that it's going to be balanced on the back of EPA, I'm also not surprised. But also State Department and Foreign Assistance, that was a surprise.
It was? Was that a surprise to you?
No, it had never been said explicitly that they plan to cut the State Department budget, but as soon as Trump said the other day it's going to be the biggest military buildup you've ever seen, or
But-
one of the biggest, or something like that. People at State Department went,
But let's put this in context. We were having this discussion, very intense discussion at the office, because, okay, so he said 54 billion for next year, right? So that's an increase, but the total Pentagon budget is 500 billion. And Obama was already projecting the budget, to bear with me here, the Pentagon budget to go up next year by 33 billion. So we're talking about not that much money, right? I mean, it's still 21 billion, but at the Pentagon, it's, pocket change almost.
Yeah.
So, what, excuse me?
For foreign assistance.
I know
That's
it's
true,
not
yeah.
for foreign assistance, but my point is, I think there's a lot of rhetoric about this massive military buildup because it sounds good to Trump supporters. And if you look at the actual numbers, yes, it is an increase in spending, but it's not going to, and yes, it is. I know it's coming out of the State Department budget, it's coming out of the EPA, it's coming out of poverty program. We assume, we haven't gotten the numbers, but he said he's not going to touch Medicare and Social Security. And so he's basically protecting retirees in the military.
But
There's
also, go ahead.
Go ahead.
as I say, we don't have real numbers to
Right.
work with yet. Even just, the White House budget director, spoke in some detail today at the briefing. We still don't have real numbers to work with, so we don't know what it means when they say that they're going to, take money out of the EPA and State Department. One report sourced to an administration official from last night said that the cut to the State Department could be 30%. That would be drastic. A lot people at State today were genuinely flipped out about that, but didn't actually think that number sounded like it could be real. But what they're more flipped out about is the idea that there's an ideological and bias against them and against diplomacy behind this. And again, this is not me talking. This is people who are in the Foreign Service or civil servants and working in the field of diplomacy feel, in some of them anyway, that there's a sense that diplomacy is being devalued here in favor of military power by an administration that doesn't understand the value of diplomacy or doesn't understand what it does. And if so, they have a very hard road in front of them. And foreign assistance is a perennial punching bag. Every Republican president going back a long way has said they were going to go after foreign aid, or at least during the presidential campaign process, candidates have said they were going to go after foreign aid, and the eventual Republican president tries to, and then it doesn't work. Foreign aid is a tiny percentage of the federal budget, about 1%. You probably all know that. We don't really give that much money away, but it is a very, very hard sell in a political campaign and in the political context that we give any money away to countries that appear to be ungrateful to receive it. And Trump played that card many times during the campaign, and I'm not at all surprised that argument is continuing to be made.
And I don't think it's necessarily all about dollars and cents. I think, there's a fear that kind of the State Department's being gutted or marginalized, and you just get the feeling there's going to be a crisis pretty soon. I mean, the North Koreans have already tested some missiles, the Iranians have tested some missiles, and the North Koreans just carried out an assassination in international space. So, I think Trump's people kind of were pretty disparaging during the campaign of Obama and Kerry, but the downside is, if there's a crisis, how do you de-escalate? How do you, if there's a confrontation in the Persian Gulf with the Iranians, which is possible, if there's a confrontation in the South China Sea, how do you de-escalate? And with the State Department sort of on holiday and the sense that it's being downplayed, I think there's going to be some crisis in the next 6 months. And how is that crisis addressed? How is it de-escalated? Is it all done through the Pentagon? Through the military guys? I mean, they play that role sometimes. There are hotlines, I think, in the Gulf. We have troops in South Korea. Are they going to play the leading role? I don't know. But I think whether, not so much definitely just about money, is if there's a crisis, who's going to play the role of trying to de-escalate?
Okay. Over here on the left, yeah, right here.
Hello. Thank you very much for an interesting perspective you put together. It was very interesting. You were very careful in one point. You never mentioned Europe in any of the foreign foreign policy. Is there any focus on this country in relations with EU, Eastern Europe, Western Balkans? Any talk about that in your perspective?
Who wants to take that?
Well, I'll start. Yes, I mean, Europe, I'll go back to the campaign for a minute. I mean, Hillary Clinton had no great reason to talk about the EU particularly, but she did talk about NATO and the importance of the NATO alliance. Trump, I think, had very little, reason, certainly to make a great argument about the EU during the campaign, except that he liked the idea of Brexit and was clearly a supporter of that. But NATO is a different thing. So he really made a run at the idea of the founding idea of NATO, which, as you imagine, may know better than most, was a very destabilizing and rattling idea and argument that, in practice, he appears not to be following at all. In fact, during their confirmation hearings and now in office, Mattis, Tillerson, and really, and everybody, Nikki Haley, have all said, "Oh no, we love NATO. We're not going anywhere. NATO's great. Like, we're sticking with NATO." And that was the message that Mattis and Pence delivered and several others delivered at the Munich Security Conference, and that Tillerson delivered 2 weeks ago at the Bonn G20 Foreign Ministers meeting in Bonn. But there clearly is great suspicion within some of circles of the Trump advisors, and as Julie says, these are overlapping and sometimes conflicting centers of power. But there clearly is a current of suspicion that appears mostly to be directed at the EU and at the idea of a diminution of national sovereignty, which is a little bit of a weird. It sounds more high-flying than I mean it. I think that the idea of the EU seems really bizarre to Bannon.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's this whole idea of anti-globalization,
Right.
And we heard him speak last week about the devolution of the administrative state, and he meant the U.S., of course, but I mean, I think that's a lot of his view of what is the appropriate role of a nation, is just to be a nation and not to be part of some big global conglomeration of interests that acts in common purpose. So I do think that's a lot of where that comes from. And interestingly, even though we did hear Mattis, and Tillerson and Nikki Haley and a lot of Trump's senior cabinet officials sort of reiterate the importance of NATO, when Theresa May was here, she had to be the one at that news conference to say, and by the way, he said in our private meeting that he was 100% behind NATO, and Trump never actually brought himself to say that out loud. And again, you don't know whether that's just because he didn't remember to say that talking point or didn't feel like it was important, but knowing what we know about how Bannon and the rest of his inner circle views this, you could imagine that it's a calculated attempt to just send the message that, we understand that NATO is there and we're dealing with NATO, but he is not 100% committed to that principle. And he, in some ways, wants to keep NATO allies on edge, wondering whether or not he is actually going to be fully committed, which is, again, not an approach we've seen in recent
Hoping
history.
to get more money out of them. Yes. Over here on the right, in this.
Hi, I'm Jen Leonard. I'm with International Crisis Group, an NGO that's worked with all of you before, I think. If you can speak to what your sense of the role of Congress might be in this mix, the prospect of Congress being engaged on these diplomatic challenges. I mean, we're also in a space and relying on you in many ways to help us navigate, reconcile these very confusing, unorthodox times. And I find myself using terminology that the president has made a pronouncement, less a policy, more a pronouncement, because if we wait long enough, we might hear something else. But in that confusing sort of mishmash of what's evolving as pronouncements, a body of pronouncements, you also have this committed ideologue, and reconciling where and how those converge or diverge is very difficult. So I'm also wondering, how long is this bizarro status, that's uncharted territory, what's your sense of how long it's going to last? Where is Congress going to fit into it? And if I can nail down to a case study, beyond Syria and the talk of Russia helping us achieve some progress there, what gives? What's the quid pro quo for Russia, whether it's Ukraine or Central Asia, et cetera? So.
Well, I think I just want to speak for all of us when I say we have no idea what's going to happen. I mean, we talk
Thank you,
about this
Elizabeth.
all the time. The question, they'll portray as a question, how does this end? We just don't know. Does anybody know? No.
No, I mean, I know on the interplay between the Congress and the administration's been interesting. I know like on the Iran issue, which the Congress was essentially at war with the Obama administration over. It's kind of been a wait and see, saying, okay, we want to ramp up these sanctions against Iran, and the White House actually did it in the first few weeks. So there does seem to be, in a Republican-led Congress, some sort of effort to coordinate with the White House as much as they can. But I think, to me, Russia's in Congress. I think there's so much skepticism that we can work with Russia that, you heard it from Lindsey Graham or McCain or Rubio, that there's this, real tension and disbelief that we can work with the Russians. One issue I kind of cast about the last couple of weeks, saying, okay, if Trump's really going to go slack on the Russians, where is it going to be? And the one issue I kind of focus on was Montenegro, because they're supposed to join NATO in the next few months, and the Montenegrin government has basically accused Putin of supporting a coup there in October to overthrow the government so they wouldn't join NATO. And I was surprised that I would have thought the Trump White House would have said, we're going to wait and see, but the Senate Foreign Relations Committee voted like 99-0 to support Montenegro a few weeks ago, and the White House, their indications are they're going to support it. That to me is something that Putin is going to, that could be a real direct, I can't think of anything in the short term that could cause more of a headbutting between Washington and Moscow than supporting another European country joining NATO. But all signs are that the White House supports it. That came from the top level. So I think the question of what the Russians would want, they want NATO rolled back, they want certainly sanctions lifted, and they want some sort of acknowledgement of their sphere of influence. But outside of Trump's kind of admiration for Putin, I haven't seen anything concretely that looks that they're gonna go in that direction.
And I think arms control is another open question. Been some indications coming from the Trump White House that they're not excited about arms control follow on to start. And there's the report that during a phone call between Trump and Putin, it was Putin who raised renegotiation follow-on to start, and Trump reportedly, again, this wasn't my paper, put his hand over the phone, turned to somebody, what is that? And got the quick download on what it was they were talking about, and came back to the phone and said, nah, I don't know, we're not that excited about it. So that's something that Congress will be involved in. But it's also it's a potential area of cooperation with Russia that past administrations have always pointed to as a great achievement, that even though two governments disagree ideologically and on and on and on, they can agree on that. I think if arms control falls apart as an organizing principle for the United States and Russia, that many other things may fall by the wayside as well, including potentially space cooperation. It's entirely possible.
Here in the front row, I mean the second row.
So it dovetails nicely with the question I was going to ask. Oh, sure. And I'm just curious, because I know that there have also been sort of rumblings about the idea of possibly a congressional investigation of the campaign ties with Russia. Whether or not that comes to fruition is to be seen, but
Well,
I'm just
there
curious.
There is an investigation, but it's not a special prosecutors. You know.
Right, which is the latest. But I'm just curious what the geopolitical implications that you see sort of beyond that, and perhaps in the Middle East most particularly.
Of a Russia investigation?
Well, I mean, I think the investigation's going to handcuff Trump if he really does want to reach out to the Russians in some ways, because anything he does is going to be cast under, oh, he was on the take, or he's a KGB agent. So I think the geopolitics are going to be, and I think there's been a lot of reports out of Moscow from Russian parliamentarians or government officials saying, you know, we had this great hope of some sort of rapprochement with the United States, but the U.S., the internal political mechanics of our system won't allow it. You know, there's cooking up all of these allegations against Trump that aren't true, and that's internal sabotage. But I think it's going to make it much more difficult for him to do things he wants to do, whether it's in Syria or in, you know, in the broader Middle East, because everything he does now is going to be cast as he's on the take.
Right, and I also think, I mean, to the degree that Congress is going to be involved in any of these things, not putting the investigation aside, but I mean, if their support is needed for any move that the president would want to make anywhere, but certainly with regard to Russia, I mean, they're also under a lot of political pressure. This is something that everyone's constituents is watching play out in real time, and you know, there are a lot of questions, and for as long as there's an investigation that's an active investigation going on, I think you'll find members of Congress of both parties saying, like, I don't want to be associated with what appears to be some sort of sweetheart in cahoots deal between Trump and Russia. I mean, I think, you know, in general, what we're seeing right now in Congress is sort of hands off on foreign policy in general. Like they don't know where Trump is headed either. And I think they're watching to see what the signals are from the White House. And even on their best and most assertive days, you know, Congress often doesn't wade into these things. We saw them debate and then pull back on the idea of a authorization for the use of military force. That debate could spark up again, but it might not. So I think that they're in a wait and see attitude anyway. But I think Jay's right that the investigation just kind of makes all of these potential moves more perilous, and so he wouldn't have the support on the Hill that he would need to back him up on something like that.
I mean, the other interesting thing today, the head of the House Intel Committee gave a briefing, and it felt to me like this is headed to what we saw in the Bush administration, where you had the leak of this information about aluminum tubes in
Yellow
Niger,
cake,
and you know, fake intel, and that turned into a leak investigation, and that took years. And listening to Nunes today, it looks like the Republican position is who leaked this, who in the Obama administration leaked this, and that's where they want it to head. So the politics of this are going to be poisonous, I would think.
Let's see, yes, in the front row here. Second row. Thank you. Then I'll go in the back, yeah.
Thanks very much. Caroline Miller from the Australian Embassy. Just going back to Congress, it's very weird for us from parliamentary systems to think that when the president comes out with his budget, it's actually a sort of statement of a wish list, if you like, because it has to obviously go through the Congress. And while you have a Republican Congress, it's very unclear that the Republican leadership will necessarily share all of the priorities of the president. I just wondered if you had a sense of how much pushback there might be to things like massive cuts to foreign aid or big cuts to the State Department or other things that the president may choose to do. My first question. Second one is, the thing that worries us in the Asia Pacific really is the future of American leadership. And one of the most worrying things about pulling back from the TPP was it was a big signal of the disengagement. So any thoughts you have in this very early and preliminary stage when we're all floundering around about where you think this administration might go with the Asia Pacific and maintaining its leadership role would be very interesting to us.
You want to take that?
Well, sure. On the the TPP and the Asia Pacific, I agree with you on the signal sent very intentionally, but on the TPP. But I also think that, like Julie was saying earlier, they're not always thinking through the full, horizon of what they're doing at this point. After railing against the TPP as a terrible deal and almost as bad as NAFTA, Trump really couldn't have stuck with it. There might have been some way to postpone pulling out of it, to soften the blow a little bit, to try to organize at least the beginnings of a replacement diplomatic coalition to further the idea that it's a useful American project to have big Asian nations and smaller Southeast Asian nations allied through trade and commerce against China, which of course was the diplomatic thrust behind TPP that the Obama administration it used to talk to fairly openly and then stopped doing so toward the end. But the larger question you're asking about, is TPP a stand-in for retracting and pulling back from American leadership in that part of the world and elsewhere? I think it is. I just don't know what the full ramifications of that will be, or what their intention for those ramifications will be. It may simply be as simple. It may be as simple as, they don't see the value, the cost value in it. What has, other than the projection of military force, what has American trade and diplomatic engagement, oftentimes very difficult diplomatic engagement, not usually with Australia, although recently that seemed to go differently. What has that gotten for the United States is a question that I could easily imagine Bannon and company asking, right? And I mean, we used to spend a whole lot of time and effort and money on the Philippines, and now the guy running the Philippines makes it a right. I mean, where did that get us? So I can imagine how that argument might be playing out. Is my point.
But doesn't this help China? I mean, isn't this a big opening for China?
Absolutely. They're like, okay,
yeah.
So well.
I mean, I've been surprised how little you heard about Asia in the last month at all. To be fair, like I think Secretary Kerry made one of his first trips to Asia, then almost never went back.
Because Obama was there so often.
Right. But I mean, I do think the North Korea thing is going to suck them in pretty quickly because, I think the Chinese are really exposed now, having their ally essentially assassinate someone in an international airport. It's going to be, I mean, I've heard kind of rumblings. I don't know, it got into Trump's head yet that, they're going to use Interpol, and you could turn this into a law enforcement issue against Kim Jong-un because, they've tried all sorts of other types of pressure. You use Interpol, you use the UN now, and how are the Chinese going to kind of stand up for an assassination of a person in an international airport? So I think they've kind of pushed it to the back, but I think even the Obama administration, were telling the Trump people during the transition that the North Koreans it's probably going to be your first real crisis, and they've kind of lived up to it to a T.
Yeah. Let's see. You know what? How are we doing for time? Maybe I'll start taking a couple questions at a time. So you two right here in the front, and then back there in the blue. So let's have 3 questions in a row.
Okay. Thank you. Very interesting. I'm Cynthia from the Mexican Embassy. You've been talking about how the president has been able to change his opinion or change his rhetoric. Do you think there's any hope regarding the wall, NAFTA, and immigration?
Okay, and then gentleman here.
Yeah, maybe a complementary question to what my colleague from the Mexican Embassy. I'm from the Salvadoran Embassy. My question is the Western Hemisphere. Cuba and all these upcoming elections in the region, how do you envision the non-existent foreign policy towards the region will somehow spark, or that's the question.
Okay. And then back here in the blue, right.
Thanks. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for what you guys are doing. This reporting is crucial, but it must be crazy making. So I just wanted to say thanks, because we're all reading it all night long, it seems like. My question is, do you think that just like State Department has been sidelined, at least presently, to the shadow cabinet or whatever you'd call around Trump, do you think that will happen in trade as well, where USTR will be sidelined, to Peter Navarro, whoever, or Bannon, that's a trend, an organizational trend that Trump will keep going in other subject areas as well? Thanks.
All right, so can you remember all three questions? Who wants to? Julie, you want to?
Yeah, I can start on Mexico. So the questions were, will he go back on immigration, the wall, or NAFTA? So I think on NAFTA, no. I mean, I think he ran on NAFTA's a horrible deal. As one of my colleagues here said, he talked about it in even worse terms than he did TPP, and that was he had a lot of negative things to say about TPP as well. So I think he's very serious. Everyone around him is very serious about reopening NAFTA, renegotiating NAFTA, doing something that will upend what we now know as NAFTA. And I don't think we know what that looks like, but he's expressed his preference for bilateral trade deals, and that he thinks that the United States does the worst out of anyone out of NAFTA is the way he sees it. And so I don't see that changing. On the wall, I think he's going to continue to talk very tough about building the wall, and I think we will probably see some activity to sort of get that going. I still don't know what the Mexico will pay for it threat is going to yield. I do think one of the tempering factors there, though, is Congress, because he is going to need to get some appropriated money to pay for. I mean, if he really is intending to fortify the border in a way that's much more aggressive than it is right now, and there already is fencing on the border, obviously. There's already some barricades on the border. If he really wants to lean into that in the way that he says he does, he's going to need Congress to appropriate some money. And in a budget which is already, he's already said he's going to put all this money toward, military, weapon systems and the military in general. I imagine the wall will be part of that, but Congress is going to want a say, and is going to have a say on how much of that money is spent on the border. And my guess is that their idea of how much it should be is going to be very different than what Trump's idea is. So I think we could see some maybe less aggressive measures than what he's already talked about. And then on immigration broadly, I mean, on the travel ban and all of the raids that they're doing now to deport people, I think it's a very concerted effort to show a lot of toughness right at the outset. There are a lot of issues, though, where I think that they haven't decided how they want to handle it. The Dreamers is one example, but just in general, how they're going to handle enforcement, I think, is also an open question, and it is also a question of appropriations. They're going to need a lot bigger of a ICE force and a lot bigger of U.S. Customs and Border Patrol in order to achieve the goals that he has laid out there and that are in his executive order. And so I don't think we know exactly what that's going to look like.
Okay, did everybody get your question answered, more or less?
That was just it.
Okay.
Well, I'll take one quick one on part of your Western Hemisphere question. I think certainly Trump and many of his advisors are deeply skeptical of Obama's moves on Cuba, but I do not see any real impetus to try to reverse that. And Congress plays a role there too. There are Cuba hawks who railed against the opening and still do. but those voices are somewhat muted, and they don't appear to be the voices that Trump is listening to. So I'll be surprised if there's really a change on Cuba. And to your question on whether this is a White House-centered model appears to be the operating principle. My suspicion is yes, but we don't have other data points yet at this point. I mean, the Pentagon is always, by virtue of its enormous size, a very separate and mission, a very separate center of gravity that just runs on its own steam, and that, of course, historically can often cause problems with the White House. But I think there's no way that the White House can centralize control over the Pentagon in a really effective manner. It's never worked. So I think in many ways, this may be his strong partnership with the military, or plans for that, and integration of many military leaders into the White House might bode well for how the White House Pentagon relationship works. But every other agency doesn't have the same abilities and power and money that the Pentagon has, and they're much easier for the White House to assert control. I'd just say based on the State Department model and the many of the people who were put forward, and many of them now confirmed, to run agencies with which they had ideological, to which they were at least partially ideologically opposed in private life, would suggest that yes, they do. That is their plan.
I just wanted to say one more thing on the power dynamics, because I've been thinking a lot about it. I mean, I don't think most people are that critical about the appointments, whether it's General Mattis at the Pentagon or Tillerson at the State Department or General McMaster. You have these guys with a lot of experience, and my hopeful side is I can't imagine 12, 18 months out that a small bunch of young people or real ideologues inside the White House will be able to keep these guys checked or at bay. And your colleague Peter Baker wrote an interesting book a few years ago about Cheney and Bush, where it kind of countered what most people thought, but Dick Cheney had this incredible amount of influence over Bush. The book argues he actually had a lot of influence for about 18 months.
Right.
But then the Iraq War was done, and it kind of handcuffed him the rest of the way, even though it seemed like he did really distance himself from Cheney after not a very long period, but the damage had already been done. And when I look at, you have these kind of big figures in really important positions, and 25 or 31-year-olds in the White House, are they going to really be able to keep these guys at check? And if they're not, will there be so much damage done by that time things kind of balance themselves out? It will be too late, and it's hard to tell.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, let me take 3 more questions. Let's see that in the back there. You've had your hand up for a long time with you, and then here in the front in the blue, and then another person in the back. There in the middle, right there. You, right there. Those 3. So ask 3 questions. I'm trying to get as many in as I can. Okay, that's a good question. Let me just take these 3 questions first.
Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you very much for being here
thanks.
tonight. My name is Willem. I'm a student here at NYU DC. So I just have a question about the media coverage. You've talked a lot and we've seen a lot. So the impression we're getting from the administration is very chaotic. It's disorganized. It's imprecise language. You don't really know what's happening. But I'm just wondering, with our 24/7 news cycle and all these events that are coming out and the reports that we're getting from the White House on a daily basis, to what extent, could this be a strategy actually from the administration to create sort of chaos and obscure what's really happening? Because we're being fed, these constant news reports, and I understand from a journalistic perspective, we need to report on what's happening. It's clear. It seems every day something more bizarre is happening than the day before. But I'm just wondering, to what extent could this actually be part of a larger strategy by the White House to actually sort of create some chaos and obscure the real hidden message?
And what's the hidden message?
That's the question, but I'm just wondering, maybe it's a strategy.
It's not been out there, right? But anyways, let me get 2 other questions. Yes, there.
Thank you. My question is actually quite related, and it goes to your function and your perspective. Thinking back 6 months ago, before we had the election that caused such tumult and surprise to all of us, how, reflecting now, what do you think you should have been paying attention to 6 months ago that maybe you weren't applying such a focus to? And then the corollary, thinking 6 months from now, what do you think you should be paying attention to now that you might not be?
Good question. And then there's one more, another person, there, right, in here.
Hello, I'm another student here. Building up on the idea of like the media and how the media is being attacked, how do you see the future of the intelligence community working within like the media, and how Trump's attack on the intelligence community builds into your work, and how do you see that furthering in the next 4 years?
Okay, so who wants to take some of those?
I like your first question, because I think, from my perspective, I did not understand this far-right kind of dynamic. And 6 months ago, I didn't understand it. I think now I'm starting to get a better understanding of it. But in 6 months out, I think you look, wow, you've got French elections, you've got German elections coming around, you have Dutch, and you know, I was in France a few days ago, and there's this fear that kind of, Britain fell, the US fell, then France and these other countries. So in 6 months to a year, you could have a completely different political dynamic that I didn't foresee. I don't think a lot of people did, which is why there's so much criticism of the press. But I think that was the dynamic that was unforeseen for a lot of people. And I think when I look, where are we headed? Yeah, is this kind of, it's not just Trump who's been talking up Putin. You've got Marie Le Pen, you've got Dutch leaders in Germany. So it's like a broader trend. It's like, is this like the 30s? Are we seeing some kind of return to fascism? I don't know, but it's pretty scary, and that's the trend that I'm looking forward to.
What about the chaos question?
Yeah, so on the chaos theory, I mean, this is something that I ask myself multiple times every day. I talk about with my colleagues a lot. And I mentioned at the beginning, some of the things that Donald Trump has said foreign policy-wise, we don't actually know whether he said it by accident. Is he saying it to send a signal? Is he saying it to obfuscate? We don't know. The point is, we still have to do our jobs, and our job is to report what's happening and to try not to lose sight of the bigger stories, but also some of these small things actually tell you very revealing, important data points about how this White House is doing its work, how this president thinks, how his inner circle operates. And so, it's always a challenge to balance one against the other. I don't think I know the answer, whether, I think it can't all be chaos. I mean, some of this is by design and some of it isn't. I will say, I think that, the transition and the way the White House is working now, this is not made up. I mean, this is for anyone who's covered a campaign, a transition, a White House. This is far beyond the normal level of like, oh, we just got here, we don't exactly know how this works. This is a White House that's mostly full of people who have never worked in government before, and that's becoming very evident every day in different ways, whether it's the executive order or the way they word a statement on Holocaust Remembrance Day, although a lot of people think that was deliberate. So you don't know, but there is a level of chaos there that I think is genuine, that's important to reflect. And to the young lady's question about the intelligence community, I think the interesting thing to me, as we've watched all of this unfold with the president's criticism of both the reporters and the people who leaked to the reporters, is, you do have people who are more fearful of, getting caught as leakers, and people are more careful, but we're still hearing from people, and I think probably more so in the beginning of this administration than in any beginning of an administration that I can remember. I mean, this place is leaking in a major way, and I think it's because people, want to get out there what is happening within their agencies and in their community, and the more that, the president speaks aggressively about how horrible this is, and the more that it's about attacking the media for reporting it, I don't necessarily think that, I hope it doesn't discourage anyone from speaking out. I think the evidence is just the opposite, at least for now.
We love leaks. Anyone who has good information, you know where to find me.
We're very good at protecting our sources.
I'll add just a little bit on the chaos question. There's there's clearly a hugely high tolerance for chaos within the administration itself. We've not seen in any of the three previous administrations I've covered a willingness to have so little what they like to call message discipline. And it just keeps happening, so they must be willing to tolerate it. I mean, there would be ways that a fair amount of message discipline could be imposed. And it's not happening. So yeah, I mean, Trump clearly likes to have around him a lot of activity, and he seems to welcome a lot of differing opinions around him, even if all that means is that he gets to have the final one. That isn't that different in some ways than other presidents have operated. Bill Clinton liked to have differing opinions around him and liked to have discussions late into the night. But their first 6 months was pretty chaotic. I mean, they had a bunch of failed nominations, and they tried to roll out health care too early and badly, and all kinds of other stuff that seems sort of quaint in hindsight by comparison. But I mean, this is a different order of even compared to that.
Let me take one more question from Maureen.
Do you see any kind of breakdown of the rule of law, or really the way we have authority organized in this country? I mean, that you're going to have all these different separate entities leaking all over the place, and they all are thinking they've got to take matters into their own hands, and it's really a threat to our democracy the way we've known it. And that's one question. And then the other question is, do they care whatsoever what they're thought of in the rest of the world?
You know, can I answer that question? Because I just want to tell you that I think that maybe I'm being too Pollyanna-ish here and too positive, but I think I see the country working the way it's supposed to. We had a president with the travel ban, and we had a judge knock it down. We had the courts knock it down. We have the ACLU membership is at an all-time high. I talked to the legal director who said they raised $25 million in a weekend or in 2 weeks or something, and their annual budget is $135 million. Our subscriptions are way, way up. You know, the Times is, so the press is behaving the way it's supposed to, the courts are behaving the way it's supposed to. We haven't seen much out of Congress yet, but I think what we're seeing protests, peaceful protests. So I see this as the system working so far. I mean, you can tell me I'm too naive, but that's what I've seen. It's like the civics lesson unfolding in front of our eyes in real time.
I think that's right, but I also think that Trump's first reaction to the legal setbacks on the travel ban was to attack the legal system and to say that one judge shouldn't have the authority to do this. Those 3 judges don't know what they're doing. They shouldn't have the authority. This is the president of the United States saying that
But it didn't stop the system.
It did not stop the system.
The system is sustained.
But
so.
I mean, that's new.
No, I know. I'm not denying that we're in an uncharted territory here. I'm just trying to remain positive sometimes. No, I mean, to answer your question up there, this is very difficult territory for journalists. I mean, on one hand, it's an astonishing story to cover. On the other hand, it is, I mean, any of us can say the same thing. It is relentless. It is, as Julie said, the administration, 2 different sources will tell you this opposite things. What do you do on deadline with that information? What is true? I've had information where I have to, the senior editors in the Bureau have to approve anonymous sources, so I got a call late one night from our night editor asking, I said, who's this? Yes.
I think it was from me, right? And it was
Australia? No.
No.
It was a call, and I knew who the source was. It was this very senior administration official. And normally in a normal White House, you would say fine, and I had to pause for a minute and think about it, because it was. It's a different terrain right now. Anyway, do you want last comments before we close? Anybody else?
I mean, I agree. I tend to agree with what Elizabeth said about, we are seeing institutions, and it's fascinating to watch, working in the way that, they were set up to work. But I also agree with Anne that, we are also seeing the president lay out and his staff lay out a lot of the predicates that are clearly recognizable predicates for a very different, less democratic, more authoritarian system. I mean, when you hear, the press is the enemy of the people, when they're handpicking which reporters are going to get the daily briefing at the White House, when you're firing your acting attorney general, I could go on, we are definitely seeing more challenges to the way that the system has worked and should work than we have in the past, and I think it's holding up so far. But Trump doesn't seem to have any appetite for reining it in or scaling it back. I think he sees this as just the way he wants things to be working, and so we'll have to see where it goes.
And I agree with Elizabeth, but I guess I do still have this fear, like Trump could execute or try to do something on some local level, and the local people say we're not going to implement it. And we've seen these big protests in Washington, but I also remember some of the Tea Party people, them mobilizing. So I do wonder, like somewhere down the line, does he want to implement something? There's pushback on a local level, and then does then where do we go? And
sanctuary cities.
Or does he send a National Guard? And then you have, I'm surprised the Tea Party pro-Trump elements have been kind of quiet. They haven't been mobilized, but I'm sure they would be at some point. So that does worry me down the path.
Okay, so that's what I'll worry about 6 months from now. We have the National Guard being mobilized in California or something.
All right, thank you all very much for coming. Okay.
Thank you.